Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. I'm very pleased to welcome Monisha Rios back to Wider View. Monisha is a Gulf War era Army veteran and a doctoral candidate in liberation psychology. Her research focuses on the militarization of psychology in the United States, and her work is geared toward building a grassroots movement to conduct a people's inquiry into the United States' use of psychological warfare against peoples of the world, including its own citizens, and to amplify the voices of those who are most impacted by U.S. wars, centering on the voices of indigenous communities. She's also the creator of MIRA, a grassroots research project that focuses on moral injuries related to the causes and consequences of U.S. wars. So welcome back to Wider View, Monisha.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
Yeah. You know, we're all going through kind of a weird and a bit difficult time now as a result of this pandemic, but you had an earthquake down in Puerto Rico on Saturday. Are you and everyone down there healthy and safe?
In Vieques, where I am, we were far enough away that we didn't really have an impact by the earthquake. And so far, I haven't heard of anybody in Ponce or the other affected areas being injured.
Good.
So that's a plus. Lots of damage to buildings, though, and of course, it's traumatizing.
Mm-hmm. And what's going on with the coronavirus thing there? You guys are still in lockdown in Puerto Rico?
We are still, it's called toque de queda here, a stay-at-home order, and it's really confusing because the acting governor changes things on a regular basis. There's a lot of pressure from the private sector, of course, to reopen. There was a period where people on their way to the grocery or on their way to check on elders would be harassed by police on the Big Island. There's a lot of repression going on, a lot of protests going on because people are going hungry. And the Puerto Rican government, as usual, is not necessarily responding to human need, more so than functioning not that dissimilarly from the U.S. government currently.
No, of course. And, I know that Trump left almost all of the decision making and help up to the states. And we have states scrambling to get supplies and stealing them from one another. But of course, Puerto Rico is not a state. But so I'm concerned that you aren't getting even what people in the states are getting.
Yeah, I'm not even sure what we're getting. I know it's been confusing with the $1,200 because in Puerto Rico you don't file federal tax returns, and so there was some back and forth between Puerto Rican government and the federal government, and ultimately at the end of the day, the people haven't been getting what they need on time.
Yeah,
so, including that.
Yeah, that's what I'd heard. Well, I primarily wanted to chat with you because you've been participating in some webinars on hybrid warfare, sponsored by the World Beyond War and Psychologists for Social Responsibility. And I wanted to discuss that since, I brought that up on the show here a number of times, but I think it's still a concept that Americans aren't familiar with. So maybe we can start by just saying, what is hybrid warfare?
Sure. Yeah. So hybrid warfare is I define it as total war. War in phases, let's say. Hybrid warfare doesn't always consist of conventional warfare, like people oftentimes will think of combat zones, where there's artillery and all that. Hybrid warfare is political, it's psychological, it's economic, and it's conventional. So it is total, complete war. It's part of what the United States is enacting upon Latin America with regime change operations. It's what the United States and its allies really have been doing for a long time toward the countries in the non-aligned movement through economic sanctions, political pressure, political alienation, as well as the manipulation of public opinion around these nations and around the peoples of these nations. So hybrid warfare is, it's not new either. It's the tactics of it, like the essence of it, has been around since the early colonial period, U.S. westward expansion, since the Spaniards invaded the Caribbean. All of this use of just abuse and punishment of innocent people, really for the theft of resources and the gaining of wealth and the hoarding of wealth, as well as the intentional underdevelopment of sovereign nations for the sake of, again, attaining wealth.
Yeah. It has turned a number of nations, or tried to turn a number of nations, I think, into something similar to the plantations that we had in the South. Where we have huge, tracts of land devoted to cash crops like palm oil or whatever, rather than growing food for people. It might be easier to talk about hybrid war, by focusing on, maybe one of the nations that we have been conducting this hybrid war against. I mean, I can think just off the top of my head: Venezuela, Iran, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Syria, Ukraine. I mean, there's, I'm sure there are probably 20 or 30 more nations that we're conducting some form of hybrid war against. But maybe you can talk, maybe use one of those nations or a couple as an example to show how psychologists get involved in hybrid warfare.
Sure. So off the top of my head, Venezuela, because they were recently, again, dealing with attacks from the United States with the attempt to perform regime change, or a coup, really. And so when it comes to psychological warfare, one of the ways that it's used in hybrid warfare, particularly against Venezuela, is controlling the narrative. And warfare really begins with narrative, right? So part of how the United States and its allies are currently using narrative is on their own peoples through the creation of story through mainstream media, the fabrication, really, of story through mainstream media. There's also color revolutions, which describing that in detail is hard for me because I'm still learning about them.
Yeah, the classic example that I always think of with the color revolution is Ukraine, because they've had two of them with different colors. I've seen this described also as as marginal violence theory, the idea that you have some kind of aggressive, nonviolent protests
Right.
that usually about some actual issue that
Right.
people are concerned about, but the approach here is to bait the security forces of the target government into overreacting, so that then a narrative develops about human rights violations, and they're killing people in the streets. This was done certainly in Ukraine. It was done in Libya also to justify the NATO bombing there.
Yeah.
And it seems a lot of that is directed at us, at the American people, not as, although some of it toward the people of Ukraine or Venezuela or these other nations, but mostly at us. Would you agree? Or?
Right. Yes. Yes. So I would say U.S. citizens are really a true target audience for this narrative. And then in these countries like Venezuela, that's where the color revolution, as you said, shapes the narrative for them. So then together, these two things work in conjunction with one another. You have people who don't have an understanding of what is actually happening in Venezuela, what the whole story is, that there have been coup attempts since Hugo Chavez, that really ultimately this is about controlling the resources and the ruling class within that country, which is still transitioning. So this partly is going against socialism. So this is a capitalist response to socialism, as much as it is about the usual standard operating procedure for the United States is to gain access to the country's wealth and resources and control it by proxy.
Yeah.
And yes, and the use of these psychological operations is necessary on the American people so that they give their approval or their consent for the government then to use whatever means it feels necessary to conduct regime change, for instance, with Guaido, to save the people.
Yes. Yes, save democracy and human rights in Venezuela by overthrowing the government and putting right-wing paramilitaries in charge, as we just did in Bolivia.
Exactly.
Which isn't working that well. Controlling the narrative, I think, is something that is becoming more and more clear, I think, to people. You know, I think a lot of us are beginning to understand and be able to recognize some of these narratives when they're being thrown at us. But still, I mean, even like with the Venezuelan example, we even have ostensibly left politicians like Bernie Sanders talking about Maduro's illegitimacy and Maduro's oppression of the people, which really is part of that hybrid warfare narrative, isn't it?
Yes. And especially when, like you said, more left-leaning politicians are either they're parroting the narrative as a political talking point so that they can gain votes, or they honestly believe it. I don't know. That's debatable. But absolutely, because then that's even more convincing to left-leaning people when their icons or their political figures that they place trust in are carrying the narrative forward. That makes it a lot easier for them to believe.
Right.
Without questioning it.
And I don't see the media, of course, never questions these. In fact, the media is a willing participant in developing these narratives most of the time. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You've been talking about this, and you've been studying it from the point of view of liberation psychology. Maybe you can tell me more about what you want to do, what your goals are at this point in terms of combating this hybrid warfare in the U.S.
My main goal is to create a way, to co-create a way with colonized peoples, indigenous peoples who are directly impacted by hybrid warfare, who are the targets of it, to amplify their own stories, their own narratives, their realities, so that we can not only help counter the psychological operations that are being used against us, and I'm saying this because I'm Puerto Rican. I'm talking to you from occupied Puerto Rico, where psychological operations and warfare has been conducted on us as colonial subjects. And so for everyone's liberation, we need to be able to form an analysis around this particular thing, particularly psychological warfare, because that's sort of the root of all of it. And then the additional goal is that with the information we gather together through a people's inquiry, through an international people's inquiry, then we're not only naming the problem ourselves, we are not only sharing the common experiences we have of this with each other, which can be healing and at the same time empowering of our resistance movements. It's also a way that we can then bring forward the impacts of these things as they've been used against us. How have we been suffering from them? Because that's the missing part of the story as well, especially in the first world and especially in the United States and other NATO countries. We're the ones that need to take the narrative over, basically.
What strikes me about that is how little we know about the impact of U.S. policy on the ordinary people of these countries, and not only the ones who are caught up in demonstrations or in violence during an attempted overthrow, but that the effects of this linger. Wouldn't you agree that maybe they're not just immediate?
They're lifelong. They're generations long, and this is why when you hear people talk about colonial trauma or generational trauma, like it's the same.
So you're trying to work. You also got this group MIRA, which is what is it? Moral injury. I'm sorry, I didn't remember all the acronym.
That's okay.
Yeah,
it's moral injury research and action, and it also MIRA in Spanish is look.
Yeah.
So it can be both.
And this is the project. This is what you were just talking about. That you're going to look at the impacts of the hybrid warfare. But if you have some other things you'd like to talk about, I'm game.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, I'm sure your listeners probably have already a good sense of what's happening in the world. And I would hope that those of your listeners who are voters in the United States would consider following up with a group called Vamos Puerto Rico. And the website for that is vamospr.org. And there are a lot of different independentistas in Puerto Rico. There are a lot of people who want decolonization for Puerto Rico. And just as we mentioned earlier, folks are oftentimes not aware of how their voting decisions affect policy, and then how those policies affect people that are not in the U.S. And so I would ask your listeners to maybe spend some time learning about the issue of our colonial status here in Puerto Rico. Use the power and privilege that they have as voters in the U.S. to vote for our decolonization, to pressure their representatives to listen to the people of Puerto Rico, not just in the colonial mechanism of the vote that the plebiscite votes that they make us do, but to really listen to us and help us gain our independence.
Now, how strong is the independence movement in Puerto Rico? Because again, like in other, this narrative has been well controlled, so yes. We're not going to know much about it.
It's stronger than ever.
And is it working? This is working toward a complete independence, making a nation, or is this? Is there still an active statehood movement as well?
There's still an active statehood movement as well. There's still an active status quo movement as well. The thing is that, as people can see from last summer in the ousting of Ricky Rosselló, the implantation of Wanda Vasquez, who was not an elected governor, the people, especially right now, are tired and fed up. And where there are those who still look to the United States as a savior and feel the only way forward is by being fully absorbed into the empire, there are more people who recognize we are, and we always have been, a sovereign nation. We are an occupied sovereign nation. And so now, especially after the non-response after the hurricane, and now especially with what we're going through with the earthquakes and COVID, people are waking up in a very visceral way.
People here have not heard about what's going on there. We don't hear very much unless there's some negative story to be heard. Those usually get through. Are you involved in anything else at this point?
Yeah.
Yeah. What is that?
I just received word that the membership of Psychologists for Social Responsibility elected me their next president. So I am now the president-elect.
Wow. Congratulations. Oh,
thank you.
Good. All right. Well, now you have to tell us a little more about Psychologists for Social Responsibility, since you are now an official expert on that subject.
Well, they have been around for over 30 years. They started off as a group of concerned professionals who wanted to address nuclear proliferation, war, and etc. And since then, it's evolved. It's now become more of an international organization. We have different action groups. There's a militarism action group. There's human rights. And we're constantly evolving our mission and our goals, but our values are centered on using the science that we have at our disposal, our expertise in certain areas, to try to make a difference. And so that's why you have this particular group who is largely responsible, along with the Coalition for an Ethical Psychology, for exposing Mitchell and Jessen and the APA's role in Bush's torture program, as well as pushing for the ethics codes, the American Psychological Association's ethics codes, to be changed in order to keep psychologists out of interrogation sites.
Good. That's great. Well, I'm excited to hear that you're taking that role. You must be very pleased. Thanks very much, though, for joining me today. And I hope everything continues to go well down there for you.
Thank you. I hope so too. And thanks again for having me back.
Thanks again to Monisha Rios for joining me today from the island of Vieques in Puerto Rico. A link to the Vamos website can be found in the show notes at widerviewradio.podbean.com. We're currently able to watch a rapidly intensifying hybrid war on China growing from the COVID-19 crisis. As journalist Rania Khalek tweeted, the anti-China hawkishness is going to drown out progressive momentum for universal health care and canceling student debt. Like Russiagate, this new yellow peril will lead to greater military spending and more war. Sad so many who should know better can't see that. The U.S. claims that China didn't inform us sufficiently about the virus, but Moon of Alabama reports the timeline doesn't support that claim. On January 3rd, the head of the U.S. Center for Disease Control was personally informed by his Chinese counterpart that there was an outbreak of pneumonia of unknown cause in Wuhan. On January 8th, the unknown cause was identified as a novel coronavirus. A full genome sequence of the virus was published on January 12th, and preliminary testing kits were developed and made available in Wuhan. By January 13th, another test and test protocol had been developed in Germany, and on January 17th, the WHO adopted its own refined version of the test. But in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control insisted on developing its own test and failed by contaminating its test components, and then failed for more than a month to correct the issue. The criticisms of China are designed to deflect from the failures of the U.S. government to deal with the pandemic. They're designed to keep us from questioning the cuts in social and health programs over the last several years that have greatly damaged our nation's ability to respond to the crisis. China has also been blamed for stealing U.S. jobs when it was really the neoliberal policies of the Reagan administration and those following it that gave U.S. corporations incentives to move jobs overseas. Finding someone to blame and moving towards war also diverts America from questioning why the government bailed out the banks and the major corporations to the tune of multiple trillions of dollars, but provided little help to ordinary working people. As the U.S. death toll climbs toward the 100,000 mark, efforts to blame China are continuing. As citizens, we need to be extremely wary when our government accuses other nations of bad behavior. These kinds of charges are often based on thin or no evidence and are part of a hybrid war narrative designed to pave the way for more violent forms of intervention. It's certainly seen that way by the targeted nations. A report from the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations in Beijing advised President Xi Jinping that China needs to be prepared for armed confrontation with the United States. We need to counter this kind of disinformation and psychological manipulation and work for peaceful relations and cooperation between all nations. As always, the views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of this radio station. Our aim is to provoke you to think outside the box and question the narratives you hear from the mainstream media and our national leaders. I hope we have succeeded. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.